The Kokoda Track campaign or Kokoda Trail campaign was part of the Pacific War of World War II. The campaign consisted of a series of battles fought between July and November 1942, between Japanese and Allied, primarily Australian, forces in what was then the Australian territory of Papua. Following a landing near Gona, on the north coast of New Guinea, on the night of 22 July, Japanese forces attempted to advance south overland through the mountains of the Owen Stanley Range to seize Port Moresby as part of a strategy of isolating Australia from the United States. Initially only limited Australian forces were available to oppose them, and, after making rapid progress, the Japanese South Seas Force under Major General Tomotarō Hori clashed with understrength Australian forces from the Papuan Infantry Battalion in the Australian 39th Battalion on 23 July at Awala, forcing him back to Kokoda. Following a confused night battle on 28–29 July, the Australians were again forced to withdraw. The Australians attempted to recapture Kokoda on 8 August without success, which resulted in heavy casualties on both sides, and the 39th Battalion was subsequently forced back to Deniki. A number of Japanese attacks were subsequently fought off by the Australian militia over the following week, yet, by the 14th of August, they began to withdraw over the Owen Stanley Range, down the Kokoda Track towards Ishuravar. The Japanese failed to press their assault, however, and the next 10 days proved to be a respite for the Australians. Reinforcements, including the 53rd Battalion and the headquarters of the 30th Brigade under the commander of Brigadier Selwyn Porter, arrived to bolster the Australian forces, while the 21st Brigade under Brigadier Arnold Potts also arrived at Ishuravar by the 23rd of August. The Australians faced significant supply problems despite the modest size of their forces, and the 39th Battalion was subsequently withdrawn to ease the logistic burden. The Japanese advance resumed on 26 August, forcing Potts to mount a series of delaying actions as the 21st Brigade successively fell back. First to Eora Creek on 30 August, Templeton's Crossing on 2 September, and next to a foggy 3 days later, on 5 September. However, the Japanese were now increasingly hampered by supply problems of their own as they became overextended, while the Australian defence also became better organised. Regardless, the effectiveness of the Australian units was increasingly reduced through exhaustion and sickness from operating in the harsh terrain. On 10 September, Potts handed over command to Porter, who was subsequently forced to withdraw to Iribiwa. The Japanese unsuccessfully mounted a further attack the following day, as they began to run out of momentum against the Australians, who began to receive further reinforcements, including brigades from the experienced Australian 7th Division under the command of Major General Arthur Allen. The 25th Brigade under Brigadier Kenneth Ether took over the forward area on 14 September. Heavy fighting continued around Iribiwa for the next week, however, and the Australians were again forced to withdraw on 17 September, this time to Imita Ridge, in sight of Port Moresby itself. Having outrun his supply lines and following the reverses suffered by the Japanese at Guadalcanal, Hori was now ordered onto the defensive, marking the limit of the Japanese advance southwards. The Japanese subsequently began to withdraw on 24 September to establish a defensive position on the north coast, but they were followed by the Australians under Ether, who recaptured Kokoda on 2 November. Further fighting continued into November and December as the Australian and United States forces assaulted the Japanese beachheads, in what later became known as the Battle of Bunagona. Background: Australia was ill-prepared to counter such an attack as the Royal Australian Air Force lacked modern aircraft and the Royal Australian Navy was too small and unbalanced to counter the Imperial Japanese Navy. Additionally, the army, although large, contained many inexperienced units and lacked mobility. In response to this threat, Most of the Second Australian Imperial Force was brought back from the Middle East and the government appealed to the United States for assistance. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill attempted to divert the 6th and 7th Divisions to Burma while they were en route to Australia, but the Australian Prime Minister, John Curtin, refused to authorise this movement. As a compromise, 2 brigades of the 6th Division disembarked at Ceylon and formed part of the island's garrison until they returned to Australia in August 1942. The perceived threat of invasion led to a major expansion of the Australian military. By mid-1942, the Army had a strength of 10 infantry divisions, 3 armoured divisions and hundreds of other units. The RAF and RAN were also greatly expanded, though it took years for these services to build up to their peak strengths. Meanwhile, as part of their general strategy in the Pacific, the Japanese sought to capture Port Moresby and prevent the Allies from using Australia as a base of operations. The port could have given them a base from which they could strike at North and Eastern Australia, including its vital Melbourne-Sydney-Brisbane coastal area, Australia's most densely populated and industrialised area. The Japanese could have also controlled a major route between the Pacific and Indian Oceans and cut off the Australians from American supply ships. The Japanese military considered invading Australia in early 1942 but decided against doing so in February that year. While such an invasion was debated by the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters, it was judged to be beyond the Japanese military's capabilities and no planning or other preparations were undertaken. Instead, in March 1942 the Japanese military adopted a strategy of isolating Australia from the United States by capturing Port Moresby in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Samoa and New Caledonia. The first attempt to capture Port Moresby by seaborne amphibious invasion was thwarted by the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. A month later, most of the Japanese carrier fleet was destroyed in the Battle of Midway, further reducing the possibility of major amphibious operations in the South Pacific. The Japanese now resolved to mount an overland assault across the Owen-Stanley Range to capture Port Moresby, which might have succeeded against virtually no resistance, had it been mounted in February. Looking for ways to counter the Japanese advance into the South Pacific, the Supreme Allied Commander in the Southwest Pacific area, General Douglas MacArthur, decided to build up Allied forces in New Guinea as a prelude to an offensive against the main Japanese base at Rabaul. Aware that an enemy landing at Buna could threaten Kokoda and then Port Moresby, MacArthur asked his commander of Allied land forces, General Sir Thomas Blamey, for details of how he proposed to defend Buna and Kokoda. In turn, Blamey ordered Major General Basil Morris, the commander of New Guinea Force, to secure the area and prepare to oppose an enemy advance. Morris created a force to defend Kokoda called Maroubra Force, and he ordered the 100-strong B Company of the Australian 39th Battalion to travel overland along the track to the village of Kokoda. Once there, B Company was to secure the airstrip at Kokoda, in preparation for an Allied build-up along the Papuan north coast. The unit was ordered to leave on the 26th of June but did not depart until the 7th of July. The rest of the 39th Battalion stayed on the near side of the Owen-Stanley Range, improving communications. As the militia company was securing its positions, news reached them of Japanese landings on the north coast of New Guinea. Geography. The Kokoda Track itself is a single-file track starting just outside Port Moresby on the Coral Sea and runs 60 to 100 kilometers through the Owen-Stanley Ranges to Kokoda and the coastal lowlands beyond by the Solomon Sea. The track crosses some of the most rugged and isolated terrain in the world, reaches 2,250 meters at Mount Bellamy, and combines hot humid days with intensely cold nights, torrential rainfall and endemic tropical diseases such as malaria. The track is passable only on foot, and as the campaign developed this had extreme repercussions for logistics, the size of forces deployed and the type of warfare that could be conducted. Before World War II, paths in many remote areas of New Guinea were commonly referred to as tracks. However, although the name Kokoda Trail is more consistent with U.S. English usage rather than Australian English, the term is used in official Australian Army battle honours. As a result, since the war there has been some debate over which term is correct. The Australian Macquarie Dictionary states that while both terms are in use, Kokoda Track appears to be the more popular of the two. In 1972, the national government of Papua New Guinea established a Place Names Commission. On 12 October 1972, they formally gave notice they intended to assign the name Kokoda Trail to the section of the old mail route not accessible to motor vehicles. That is, the walking path from Oa's Corner on the Sojiri Plateau to Kokoda. There was much debate, but the name Kokoda Trail was selected. Yet, in 2002, the Australian War Memorial published an article in their official magazine Wartime which advised, there has been considerable debate about whether the difficult path that crossed the Owen Stanley Range should be called Kokoda Trail, or the Kokoda Track. Both terms have been in common use since the war. Trail is probably of American origin but has been used in many Australian history books, including the Official History, and was adopted by the Australian Army as an official battle honour. Track comes from the language of the Australian bush. It too is commonly used by veterans, and is used in some volumes of Australia's official war history, thus both terms are correct. But trail appears to be more widely used. The memorial has adopted the term trail, as it is favoured by a majority of veterans and the Battles Nomenclature Committee, because it appears on the battle honours of units which served in Papua in 1942. Prelude. Japanese landings and initial assault. The Japanese, having already captured much of the northern part of New Guinea earlier that year, landed on the northeast coast of Papua on 21 July 1942, and established beachheads at Buna, Gona and Sanananda. The first Australian Army unit to make contact with the Japanese on mainland New Guinea was a platoon from the Papuan Infantry Battalion, made up of indigenous soldiers, under an Australian officer, Lieutenant John Chalk. On the 22nd of July, Chalk reported the arrival of the Japanese by sending a runner to his immediate superior. He received a handwritten note later that day, stating simply, "You will engage the enemy." That night, Chalk and his 40-strong unit ambushed Japanese forces from a hill overlooking the Gona-Sangara Road, before retreating into the jungle. Japanese attempts to build up the force at Buna also had to get past the Allied air forces. One transport got through on the 25th of July, but another on the 29th of July was sunk. Although most of the troops got ashore, a third was forced to return to Rabaul. Another convoy had to turn back on the 31st of July. However, bad weather and Japanese A6M0 fighters allowed a convoy under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikama to get through on the 14th of August and land some 3,000 Japanese, Korean and Formosan troops of the 14th and 15th Naval Construction Units. On the 17th of August, the 5th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, and elements of the 144th Regiment commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hatsuo Sakamoto, and the 55th Mountain Artillery, the 47th Anti-Aircraft Artillery and the 55th Cavalry arrived under the overall command of Engineer Colonel Yusuke Yokoyama. On the 21st of August, 2 battalions of the 41st Regiment arrived. Yokoyama ordered Tsukamoto to seize the airstrip at Kokoda, and to conduct a reconnaissance in force along the Kokoda Track. Encountering the Australian troops deployed near Kokoda, Tsukamoto deployed his infantry and marines for an attack, and quickly moved inland.